The Valthorian hegemony had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years. No one questioned their power. No one dared to challenge them. They were the masters of 1,000 star systems, and every species in the known universe had learned one simple truth. When the Valthorians came, you knelt. At the center of their empire floated a massive structure called the Throne of Subjugation. It was a mountain of black stone, bigger than most moons, orbiting the Valthorian homeworld. On its surface, carved deep into the obsidian, were the names of every species that had ever submitted to hegemony rule. Millions of names, millions of civilizations that had looked upon Valthorian power and chosen to live on their knees rather than die on their feet. The Valthorians were proud of the throne. They called it proof of the natural order. The strong ruled. The weak served. This was how things had always been. This was how things would always be. Ambassador Kethvaran had served the hegemony for 300 years. He was tall, thin, with gray skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His eyes were black pools that showed no emotion. He had personally overseen the submission of 47 species. He knew exactly how the process worked. First came fear, then came anger, then came bargaining, and finally always came acceptance. Every species followed the same pattern. Kethvaran had never seen an exception. When hegemony scouts discovered a small blue planet on the edge of the galaxy, Kethvaran was sent to deliver the standard message. The planet was called Earth by its inhabitants. The species living there called themselves humans. They were primitive by hegemony standards. They had only recently learned to travel beyond their own moon. They had nuclear weapons, which was amusing. They had been killing each other for thousands of years, which was even more amusing. Kethvaran expected this to be easy. His ship descended through Earth's atmosphere on a bright morning. He landed in a large city that the humans called New York. Thousands of humans gathered to watch his arrival. He saw fear in their eyes, which pleased him. Fear was the beginning of wisdom. The humans sent their leaders to meet him. Kethvaran looked at them with mild interest. They were small creatures, soft and fragile. Their lifespans were laughably short. How had such weak beings even survived long enough to develop technology? He delivered his message in the cold, formal tone he always used. The hegemony had discovered their world. They had two choices. They could submit willingly and become part of the empire. Their name would be carved on the throne of subjugation, and they would serve the Valthorians forever. Or they could refuse, and their world would be destroyed. The human leaders listened in silence. Kethvaran expected tears. He expected begging. He expected the usual desperate attempts to negotiate. Instead, a woman stepped forward. She was small, with dark skin and gray hair. Her name was Director Chen, and she spoke for all the nations of Earth. She asked questions. How many ships did the hegemony have? How long had they ruled? What happened to species that submitted? What happened to species that refused? Kethvaran answered each question patiently. He even showed them recordings of previous conquests. He showed them worlds that had been burned to ash. He showed them species that had been erased from existence. He wanted them to understand that resistance was not just foolish. It was impossible. Director Chen watched everything. Her face showed no emotion. When the recordings ended, she spoke again. She thanked Kethvaran for the information. She said that humanity needed time to discuss among themselves. She asked for 30 cycles to make their decision. Kethvaran almost laughed. 30 cycles? He had granted species 100 cycles before. It never changed anything. In the end, they always knelt. But he agreed. Let them have their 30 cycles. Let them feel hope before it was taken away. He returned to his ship and waited in orbit. From space, Earth looked peaceful. Blue oceans, green lands, white clouds. It would be a shame to burn it. But if the humans refused, he would not hesitate. Below him, something was happening that Kethvaran could not see. For the first time in human history, every nation on Earth stopped fighting each other. Old enemies became allies overnight. Resources were shared freely. Scientists from every country worked together. Military leaders who had spent their lives preparing to kill each other now planned together. The humans did not cry. They did not beg. They did not waste time on despair. They built. They took the technology from Kethvaran's message drones and tore it apart. They studied it. They learned from it. They improved upon it. Factories that had made cars now made weapons. Universities became research centers. Every human who could contribute did contribute. There was no argument about politics or borders. There was only one goal: survival. Kethvaran sat in his ship, patient and confident. He had done this 47 times before. He knew how the story ended. In 30 cycles, the humans would come to him with their heads bowed and their spirits broken. He was sure of it. He had never been more wrong about anything in his 300 years of life. The 30 cycles passed quickly, and when they ended, Kethvaran descended to Earth for the second time, expecting surrender. What he found instead would change the galaxy forever. 30 cycles had passed. Kethvaran descended through Earth's atmosphere for the second time, fully expecting to receive humanity's surrender. He had prepared the ceremonial documents. He had rehearsed the words he would speak when the humans knelt before him. Everything was ready. But as his ship broke through the clouds, his instruments began to scream warnings. The sky around Earth was no longer empty. Hundreds of objects floated in orbit. They were crude and ugly, built from metal and fire instead of elegant hegemony technology. But they were armed. Weapons that had not existed 30 cycles ago now pointed at his ship from every direction. Kethvaran felt something he had not felt in centuries: confusion. He landed at the same place as before, but the city looked different now. The tall buildings were covered in strange equipment. The streets were filled with soldiers carrying weapons he did not recognize. The fear he had seen in human eyes before was gone. It had been replaced by something harder, something colder. A single human came to meet him. She was a woman with dark skin and short black hair. Her uniform was simple but clean. She walked like someone who was not afraid of anything. Her name was Commander Yara Okonkwo. She spoke for humanity now. Kethvaran looked down at her. She was so small, so fragile. He could break her neck with one hand if he wished, but something in her eyes made him pause. He asked if humanity had made their decision. Commander Okonkwo nodded. Her voice was calm and steady when she spoke. "We declined," she said. Kethvaran did not understand at first. The words made no sense to him. Species did not decline. In 12,000 years of hegemony rule, not a single civilization had ever refused submission. It simply did not happen. He explained what would follow their refusal. His voice grew louder as he spoke. Their cities would burn. Their children would be taken as slaves. Their world would become a mining colony. Every human would suffer until the last one died. He showed her recordings of what had happened to other species that resisted. Worlds turned to glass. Oceans boiled away. Entire civilizations erased as if they had never existed. Commander Okonkwo watched it all. Her face did not change. When the recordings ended, she spoke again. Her words would be remembered for centuries. "We have seen worse," she said. "We did worse to ourselves. The difference is that we learned from it." Kethvaran stared at her. He did not know how to respond. In all his years, he had never met anyone like this. He had broken kings and presidents. He had made emperors weep. But this small human woman looked at him as if he were nothing special. As if he were just another problem to be solved. He returned to his ship and contacted the induction fleet waiting beyond the moon. He gave the order to attack. Let the humans learn what defiance cost. The fleet moved forward. 20 massive warships, each one capable of destroying a continent. They had crushed hundreds of civilizations. They expected Earth to fall in hours. They were wrong. Human ships rose to meet them. The ships were ugly and rough, built in 30 cycles from stolen technology and desperate innovation. But they fought with a ferocity the hegemony had never seen. Human pilots flew their vessels directly into hegemony warships, destroying themselves to damage the enemy. They used weapons that the hegemony had banned 1,000 years ago because they were too destructive. They did not retreat. They did not surrender. They fought like beings who had nothing to lose. The battle lasted 3 days. When it ended, the induction fleet was broken. Burning wreckage filled Earth's orbit. Only 4 hegemony ships escaped, fleeing back to Valthorian space with news of the impossible. Kethvaran was among the survivors. He had lived for 300 years and overseen 47 submissions. He had believed himself to be an instrument of inevitable fate. Now he sat in a damaged ship, staring at nothing, trying to understand what had happened. The humans had won. It should not have been possible. Every calculation, every historical example, every law of galactic civilization said that primitive species could not defeat the hegemony, and yet the proof was floating in the void around him, burning and broken. Back on Earth, Commander Okonkwo stood on a rooftop and watched the enemy ships retreat. The sky was full of fire and debris. Millions of humans had died in the battle. Cities were burning. The cost of victory was terrible, but they had won. Around her, surviving soldiers began to cheer. The sound spread across the planet, carried by radio and television, and the voices of billions of people who had just learned that the impossible was possible. They had refused to kneel, and they had survived. But Okonkwo did not celebrate. She knew this was only the beginning. The hegemony would not accept this defeat. They would return with more ships, more weapons, more fury. Earth had won a battle, not a war. She looked up at the stars, knowing that somewhere out there, ancient beings were learning about humanity for the first time. She wondered what they would do next. Whatever it was, humanity would be ready. They had learned something important today, something that changed everything. The hegemony could be beaten. The news of the induction fleet's defeat spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass. In the great halls of the Valthorian homeworld, the High Council met in emergency session. For the first time in 12,000 years, they did not know what to do. The throne of subjugation orbited above them, that massive monument covered with millions of names. Every one of those names represented a species that had accepted hegemony rule. Every one of those names was proof that resistance was pointless. But now a primitive species from the edge of the galaxy had proven that proof to be a lie. The council argued for days. Some wanted to negotiate. Perhaps they could offer the humans special terms. Perhaps they could make them partners instead of servants. But the eldest members refused. To negotiate with those who had defied them would be to admit weakness. And if the hegemony showed weakness, other species might remember that rebellion was possible. They decided to send the Purification Armada, 10,000 warships, weapons capable of destroying stars. Soldiers bred for nothing but war. This was not an invasion force. This was an extinction force. The humans would not simply be defeated. They would be erased. Every city would be destroyed. Every record would be burned. Every human would be killed. When the Armada was finished, it would be as if humanity had never existed. Supreme Commander Valeth led the Armada personally. He was ancient, even by Valthorian standards. He had commanded the destruction of 100 rebellious worlds. He had never failed. The journey to Earth took 1 full year. Hegemony ships were fast, but the galaxy was vast. And during that year, humanity was not idle. Commander Okonkwo had been promoted to Admiral. She knew the hegemony would return, and she knew Earth alone could not survive a second attack. They needed allies. She sent messages across the galaxy, not to the Valthorians, but to the species the Valthorians had conquered. For 12,000 years, these species had lived under hegemony rule. They had been told resistance was impossible. They had believed it. But now they had seen Earth's victory. They had seen the induction fleet burn. And deep inside them, something began to wake up. 3 species answered humanity's call. The Korath were warriors who had been forced to serve as soldiers for the hegemony. They hated their masters, but had never believed they could fight back. The Selenith were engineers whose technology had been stolen and controlled for millennia. They dreamed of freedom, but had never dared to act. The Mulvari were survivors of a world the hegemony had nearly destroyed. They remembered what it meant to resist. These 3 species sent ships, soldiers, and scientists to Earth. They shared knowledge that humanity had never dreamed of. They taught humans how to build better weapons, faster ships, stronger shields. In return, humanity taught them something more important: hope. For the first time in thousands of years, the enslaved species of the galaxy began to believe that the hegemony could fall. When the Purification Armada arrived in the Sol system, they expected to find a primitive world waiting to die. Instead, they found a fleet. Human ships and allied vessels hung in space like an iron wall. They were still outnumbered badly. The Armada had 10,000 ships. The Coalition had less than 3,000. But numbers were not everything. Supreme Commander Vyleth gave the order to attack. He expected the battle to last hours. It lasted 47 days. The humans and their allies fought like nothing Vyleth had ever seen. They used tactics that broke every rule of civilized warfare. They hid in asteroid fields and struck from ambush. They sent ships loaded with explosives into the heart of hegemony formations. They refused to retreat even when retreat was the only logical choice. Earth itself became a weapon. Orbital platforms that had been hidden in the oceans rose up and fired on hegemony ships. Ground-based weapons shot into space. Even civilians fought, using anything they could find as weapons. The hegemony destroyed half of Earth. Continents burned. Oceans boiled. The moon was shattered by a direct hit, sending debris raining down on the planet below. 3 billion humans died, but they did not surrender. On the 47th day, Admiral Okonkwo led a final attack against Vyleth's flagship. Her ship was damaged and burning. Half her crew was dead, but she pushed forward anyway, knowing that everything depended on this moment. Human Marines boarded the flagship. They fought through corridors filled with smoke and blood. They lost soldiers at every step, but they kept moving forward, driven by something the Valthorians had never understood. Humanity had nothing left to lose, and beings with nothing to lose are the most dangerous things in the universe. Admiral Okonkwo herself found Vyleth on the bridge of his ship. He was wounded but still alive. He looked at her with eyes full of hatred and confusion. "This is impossible," he said. "You are insects. You are nothing." Okonkwo raised her weapon. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "We are humanity," she said, "and we do not kneel." Supreme Commander Vyleth died with those words in his ears. When his flagship exploded, the Purification Armada broke. The surviving ships fled in all directions. Some surrendered. Most tried to escape. Few made it. The battle for Seoul was over. Humanity had paid a terrible price. Half their population was dead. Their world was scarred and broken. But they had won, and now the galaxy knew that the hegemony was not invincible. Everything was about to change. The destruction of the Purification Armada sent shockwaves across the galaxy. For 12,000 years, the hegemony had been unstoppable. Their word was law. Their power was absolute. Species lived and died at their command. But now 2 great fleets had fallen to a species that should have been easy prey. The Induction Fleet had been destroyed. The Purification Armada had been shattered. And suddenly the chains that had held the galaxy in place began to crack. On 100 worlds, enslaved species looked up at the stars and asked themselves a dangerous question. If the humans could fight back, why could they not do the same? The rebellion started slowly. A mining colony here, a factory world there. Workers who had spent their lives serving the hegemony simply stopped working. Soldiers who had been forced to fight for their masters turned their weapons the other way. It was not organized at first. It was just anger, finally given permission to exist. The Valthorian High Council watched their empire crumble and did not know how to stop it. They had ruled through fear for so long that they had forgotten how to do anything else. When fear stopped working, they had nothing left. They tried to crush the rebellions with force, but their forces were spread too thin. They tried to make examples of rebel worlds, but each destroyed world only created more anger. They tried to negotiate, offering freedom to some species if they would help fight the others. But no one trusted them anymore. Admiral Okonkwo watched all of this from Earth. Her world was still recovering from the war. Cities were being rebuilt. The dead were being mourned. Humanity had won, but the cost had been terrible. Some of her advisors wanted to stop. They had defended their home. They had proven themselves. Perhaps it was enough to simply survive and let the hegemony collapse on its own. But Okonkwo knew better. The hegemony was wounded, but not dead. If given time, they would rebuild. They would find new soldiers, new weapons, new ways to enslave. And one day they would return to Earth for revenge. The only way to truly end the threat was to end the hegemony itself. She gathered the coalition that had fought beside humanity at Seoul, the Karath warriors, the Selenith engineers, the Mulvari survivors. and now dozens of other species who had joined the fight. Together, they formed a fleet larger than anything Earth could have built alone. They began to move toward Valthorian space. As they traveled, more species joined them. Some sent ships, some sent supplies, some simply sent messages of support. The coalition grew with every passing day. The Valthorians watched them coming and knew they were doomed. Their military strength was broken, their economy was collapsing. Their subjects were in revolt. They had nothing left to fight with except desperation. The High Council sent messages to Admiral Okonkwo, begging for negotiation. They offered to free some species from slavery. They offered to share their technology. They offered to reduce the tributes that conquered worlds had to pay. Each offer was weaker than the last. Each offer showed how afraid they had become. Admiral Okonkwo rejected them all. "We are not negotiating for better terms," she transmitted to the High Council. "We are ending terms altogether. The age of submission is over. No species will ever kneel to you again." The coalition fleet entered Valthorian space without opposition. The defending fleets had been destroyed or had surrendered. The mighty hegemony, which had ruled 1,000 star systems, could not protect its own borders. They pushed deeper and deeper into enemy territory. World after world fell without a fight. Valthorian governors fled or were captured. Slaves were freed by the millions. The empire that had stood for 12,000 years was dying. Finally, the coalition reached the Valthorian homeworld, and there, hanging in orbit like a dark moon, was the throne of subjugation. Admiral Okonkwo stood on the bridge of her flagship and looked at the massive structure through the view screen. It was even larger than she had imagined. The black stone seemed to swallow light. Even from this distance, she could see the countless names carved into its surface. Every species that had ever knelt to the hegemony was represented there. Every civilization that had chosen slavery over death. Every world that had given up hope. There was a space prepared for humanity's name. The Valthorians had been so confident. They had carved out the space before the induction fleet even reached Earth. That space would remain empty forever. The High Council made one final offer. They would surrender completely. They would give up all power. They would free every slave. They only asked that the throne be preserved. It was their history, they said, their heritage. Admiral Okonkwo considered their words. Around her, representatives from 100 species waited to hear her answer. She thought about all the names on that throne, all the species who had been broken, all the civilizations who had been told that resistance was impossible. She thought about what the throne represented, not just history, not just heritage. It was a symbol of power. As long as it existed, it would remind the galaxy that some were meant to rule and others were meant to serve. Her answer was simple. No, the throne had to burn. The Valthorian High Council made their final stand around the throne of subjugation. They gathered every remaining ship, every soldier, every weapon they could find. It was not much. Their empire had crumbled. Their armies had scattered. But they would not give up the throne without a fight. The throne was more than a monument to them. It was proof that they were special, proof that they deserved to rule. As long as it existed, the names carved upon it said that submission was the natural order of things. The strong commanded, the weak obeyed. This was the way of the universe. The coalition fleet approached slowly. Ships from 100 species flew together, their differences forgotten in the face of a common goal. Humanity led the way, but they were not alone. They had never been alone, not since that first terrible battle at Seoul. The fighting began at the edge of the Valthorian system. It was brutal and bloody. The defenders fought with the fury of beings who had nothing left to lose. They knew that if they failed, everything they had built would be destroyed. But the coalition had something stronger than desperation. They had hope. Ships burned on both sides. Soldiers died in the thousands. The battle spread across the system, filling the void with fire and wreckage. But slowly, inevitably, the coalition pushed forward. Admiral Okonkwo watched from her flagship as the defensive lines broke one by one. She had fought so many battles now. She had lost so many friends. Sometimes she could barely remember the woman she had been before all of this started. That woman had been a commander in a world that had never known aliens existed. That woman had believed that humanity's greatest enemies were other humans. How wrong she had been. Now she commanded a fleet of 100 species. Now she was about to end a tyranny that had lasted 12,000 years. Now she was about to do something that no one had ever done before. The final defensive line fell. The path to the throne was open. Admiral Okonkwo transferred to a landing ship with a small team of Marines. She did not have to go herself. She could have sent others. But she had started this journey when she refused to kneel before Kethvarin, and she intended to finish it personally. The landing ship touched down on the surface of the throne. The structure was vast beyond imagination. Its black stone stretched in every direction like a frozen ocean. The names carved into its surface covered every visible surface, millions upon millions of them. Each name was a species. Each name was a civilization that had chosen submission over death. Okonkwo walked through the corridors of the throne, her boots echoing on the ancient stone. The halls were empty now. The Valthorian priests who had maintained this place had fled. The soldiers who had guarded it were dead. She found the central chamber where new names were carved. It was a vast circular room with walls that rose higher than any building on Earth. And there, prepared and waiting, was the space for humanity's name. The letters had already been sketched in outline. The Valthorians had been so certain of victory. They had prepared everything in advance, ready to complete the carving as soon as humanity submitted. Okonkwo placed her hand on the cold stone. She felt the weight of 12,000 years pressing down on her. All the species who had been broken here, all the civilizations who had given up hope, all the beings who had believed that resistance was impossible. She had proven them wrong. All of them. Even the humans who had doubted, who had wanted to surrender, who had said that some enemies were too powerful to fight. She lifted her communicator and gave the order. From every ship in the coalition fleet, weapons fired. Energy beams and missiles and plasma bolts converged on the throne of subjugation. The ancient obsidian began to crack. The names carved into its surface began to glow with heat. Okonkwo walked back to her landing ship as the throne burned around her. She did not run. She did not hurry. She walked with the steady pace of someone who had already won. The throne of subjugation did not just fall. It burned. The obsidian melted. The names carved into its surface turned to ash and scattered into the void. 12,000 years of enforced obedience vanished in fire and light. Across the galaxy, enslaved species watched the broadcast. They saw the symbol of their chains turn to nothing, and they understood, finally and forever, that they were free. Admiral Okonkwo's landing ship cleared the debris field just as the throne's core collapsed. She turned to watch through the viewport as the last fragments burned away. When nothing remained but empty space and cooling embers, she spoke. Her words were broadcast to every corner of the galaxy. No more thrones, she said. No more names carved in stone. No more kneeling. From this day forward, every species decides its own fate. You bow to no one unless you choose to. The Valthorian hegemony did not survive the burning of the throne. Without their symbol of power, without their claim to divine right, they had nothing left to hold their empire together. The remaining Valthorians were not punished or enslaved. That would have made the coalition no better than the hegemony. They were simply left alone, one species among many, no more and no less. Humanity did not build an empire from the ashes. That was not why they had fought. Instead, they helped create a coalition of equals. Every species had a voice. Every world was sovereign. No one would ever force another to kneel again. Years passed. The scars of war slowly healed. New generations were born who had never known the hegemony's rule. They learned about the old days in school, about the time when the galaxy had been divided between masters and slaves. It seemed impossible to them. How could anyone have accepted such a thing? In the place where the throne had once orbited, there was now only empty space. But every ship that passed through that region slowed down for a moment of silence. They remembered what had stood there. They remembered what it had meant, and they remembered the fire that had set them free. Admiral Yara Okonkwo lived to see the new galaxy take shape. When she died, old and tired and satisfied, representatives from every species attended her funeral. They did not build a throne in her honor. She would have hated that. Instead, they built a simple monument with simple words carved into its surface. Here lies a human who refused to kneel. It was enough.